That's it. Right. Good evening, councillors and officers of the council and fellow other councillors and other members of staff. Welcome to this meeting of the Constitutional Review Working Party. There's the usual precautions in relation to fire evacuation procedures. If the fire alarm is activated, please vacate the offices via the stairs. Do not use the lifts and assemble in Hawley Square on the green, and officers will assist and advise when it's deemed safe to return. Does anyone intend filming the meeting? No? Good. Would everyone please ensure that their mobile phones are turned to silent and they are not used to make or receive calls in the chamber whilst this meeting is in progress? Please note this meeting is being live streamed for members of the public, except for any item of business or exempt or confidential information is considered following the exclusion of the press and the public from the meeting. Would any member wish to speak under Council Procedure Rule 20.1? Please announce it. Councillor Crittenden.
I think you've got me down already.
And Councillor Thorpe or not?
No. Staff.
Oh, no, she's not Councillor. Sorry. Do apologise.
Most of the staff don't want to be councillors. Understandable.
Right. Apologies for absence. We've got Caroline Rushton and Councillor Everett. I don't think there's anybody else. Okay. Yes. And are there any apologies for absence? Any declarations of interest? No? Good. Minutes of the previous meeting. I move that the minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of November 2023 be approved and signed as a correct record. Could I have a seconder, please? Councillor Austin. Unless anyone else has any objections to the minutes, I will take them as agreed. Thank you. Contract Procedure Rules, Agenda Item 4. Now we've got that Chris Blundell is presenting the report. Who's Matthew? You're doing, are you? Matthew Salmon. I call upon you then, Matthew, to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. So the new Procurement Act for 2023 is anticipated to come into force in October 24. This will require a number of changes to be incorporated into CSOs to reflect the requirements that are captured under the new Act going forward and those requirements that will still sit under the Public Contract Regulations 2015. A full rewrite of CSOs will be required in the future due to the number of changes potentially being made. At this time, full guidance on the implementation is limited, and therefore we have instead opted for a refresh rather than the full rewrite. This refresh has been undertaken to ensure that following a recent review of the procurement process and with further amendments to CSOs anticipated in October, that these remain fit for purpose during this interim period. This is in the main due to the changes to current levels of projected spend across the organisation and what are seen to be key regeneration and housing projects over the medium term. These changes will create capacity to focus attention on these projects. Whilst there are a number of subtle amendments, the main changes of significance are to formally implement changes to the spend thresholds, increase the values of the thresholds for below threshold contracts, and an update to organisational changes in job titles. The supporting documents referred to within the links to CSOs will be refreshed once these have been approved, with particular emphasis on the purchasing guide. This purchasing guide provides practical guidance on how the CSOs apply to purchasing decisions and processes. It explains some of the more technical and legal issues involved in procurement and provides practical working examples. Members will have an opportunity to see the newly developed purchasing guide once this has been updated and presented to a future meeting of Constitutional Review Working Party as appended to the new reworked 2023 compliant CSOs. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. Does anybody wish to make any comment? Councillor Crittenden.
Thank you. The main reason I came here tonight was actually to speak on agenda item 6, but I do have a very brief comment that I'd like to make on this one. And that is that it states that councillors have access to the intranet. Well, I have just been talking to Hannah Thorpe before the start of the meeting, and I understand that that is being worked on regarding it. But the main point I wanted to comment here is that regards to the whistleblowing policy in paragraph 1.6, it does state that it can be obtained from the monitoring officer. I do feel that to have to ask the monitoring officer to look at the whistleblowing policy could be a breach of confidentiality. If someone is feeling that they need to raise something under whistleblowing policy, then it's not appropriate for them to have to show their hand first to ask for permission to read the document. And so that should be independently available without having to either request access from Google Docs or the whistleblowing officer. That's how I feel.
Councillor Crittenden, can I just clarify, is that in relation to the item that under discussion? That seems...
Item 4?
Oh, apologies.
It's just one paragraph, one line. The rest of it I have no comment on.
Apologies.
Any
Thank
officer
you.
or member who suspects misconduct or corruption.
Apologies.
Does anybody else have any comments to make? Councillor Austin?
Yes, I would support what Councillor Crittenden says, and it's quite ridiculous that we don't have access to the intranet, but I'm really pleased to hear that something is happening about that, because it's the Local Government Association says it's the first thing a new councillor should do, is consult their council's website and intranet. And we've been asking for it for some years and we still don't have it. So I'm really pleased to hear that that's going to happen. And things like that will be able to be there for us to refer to. And a whole series of other things. This will come up later on when we're talking about officer responses to councillor questions. Councillors wouldn't need to ask so many questions if they had access to reference documents that they could look up for themselves. So altogether, these sorts of improvements will help, and will help provide a better background to this question and the later item.
I think your comments have been well and truly noted by the monitoring officer. Thank you. Anybody else got any comments to make? Good evening, Councillor Scobie. We accept that you're coming from London.
Where are the other members?
We are quorate, and obviously you've had a chance to read the papers. Is there anything you wish to say about item agenda 4?
Yes, and I was one of the things about the new technology is I can live stream it. So I've been listening to the debate as I've been coming up in the lift. I did hear your introduction, so and I thank you for the time yesterday talking this through. I think there was a couple of aspects of this. So as members, we don't often get an opportunity to influence things like this around procurement. And we're sort of faced with a situation of it'd be very inappropriate for us to amend what's in front of us, but the supporting documents underneath it, which underpin that, I personally feel there are several flaws in, particularly around references to cybersecurity risk management. One of the biggest increases in cybersecurity at the moment is via third-party breaches, and the council, I think, has a duty to use its role as a procurer of local services to try and increase the security down its supply chain. And I think the lack of reference to that in documents is a missed opportunity, which is hence why I asked Matt Sanham for some of his time to talk that through. And going back to the point I said, as councillors, we don't really get a chance to implement or sort of influence this because we have no reference to those underlying documents. So the procurement guides that are referenced throughout the agenda item will be dealt with by CMT and will not be dealt with by us. So we're almost left with a situation of amending something that shouldn't really be amended, voting down something that is probably quite standard or not really getting an opportunity. So my suggestion was that we accept the document as is, but there is a cabinet advisory group at the moment which is going to be looking into cybersecurity, and I think that the procurement side of this should absolutely be part of the terms of reference for that committee, because if it isn't, my concern would be that one of the issues that I don't feel is being addressed now will not be covered, and therefore a potential weakness for the council will be left open.
Thank you for your comments. Mr Hughes or Ingrid, have you anything to say?
Well, I think Councillor Scobie's already aware, and Matt will back me up, that it is proposed, and it is in fact in the report, isn't it, that there will be a full and comprehensive review and detailed review of contract standing orders over the next months, taking into account the revised legislation or the new proposed legislation, once there's further clarity in that regard. And obviously that will look at, matters in the whole. So I hope that offers some kind of reassurance, and members will obviously be again engaged in the usual way throughout that process.
Completely accept that. My point is around members' involvement. Like, this is the only opportunity we have to influence or add our opinions around procurement, because the rest of the documents are management documents. So we're sort of in a bit of a bind on this, which is why my suggestion was, as that review is being done, which councillors don't necessarily have a role in, but cabinet members may well have a role in that. But the element that I'm concerned about, particularly with regards to cybersecurity, I think can be rolled into what the work of the CAG, is going to be doing. And that's sort of the link I was trying to do, so that we don't focus on the document in front of us, because I think it's quite a standard document that we probably need to approve, but I do have some concerns around cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's noted and agreed that certainly that can be taken up through the CAG.
And Rob, I don't know if you're sort of happy with that. You probably came in halfway through, but I was just saying...
Apologies, I missed that. If you can just highlight that again for me, that's okay.
I was just saying, rather than pulling in, because some of the documents underlying this, I feel are missing references to things like testing the resilience of suppliers and talking about cybersecurity of suppliers. And there's a question of how far the council would go with that, but rather than rolling that into a discussion now, it was better to roll it into the discussions under the CAG.
Yeah, happy to look into that.
Councillor Pritchard, do you have any comments to make? Item agenda 4.
No, I think it's Councillor Scobie's points, I think, were ones I'd agree with.
Do councillors wish to make any recommendations to the Standards Committee? So you're happy for the report to go ahead as it is? Could I have a proposer, please? And the seconder? Councillor Austin. And do councillors agree? Thank you very much. Item agenda. Sorry, I thought you were going to say something.
No.
If you want to leave, Matthew, you're more than welcome to. It's entirely up to you.
I'll hang around for the other items, but generally at this point, yeah.
Okay. Item agenda 5, the councillor stroke officer protocol. Could I ask that Ingrid Brown, head of legal and democracy and monitoring officer, please present the report?
Thank you, Chair. Well, councillors will be aware that one of the recommendations of the independent monitoring officer was to do with improved councillor-officer relations across the council. And this revised protocol seeks to set the framework for that relationship. Some of the new protocol you'll see replicates that which is in the old protocol and set out at Annex 2 of the report, but the new protocol extends those provisions and has been drafted after a review of many protocols across a number of councils, and really drawing on some best practice, and those kind of messages have been incorporated into the proposed protocol that's set out at Annex 1. The structure of the protocol is slightly different, but I hope it's easy enough to follow. One of the things that came up in discussion earlier in the week was the difference between reference to councillors and members, and we've agreed that for the sake of clarity, we're going forward refer to councillors as opposed to members, because we just think it's kind of more accessible. It's what the public understand councillors to be. So for that reason, this protocol refers to councillors throughout. And in terms of the structure of the report, as I said, some of it's also in the old report, but it highlights the role of councillors and officers. I mean, the devil's in the detail, but really just to give you a kind of, and which I hope you've all had a chance to look at, but just to sort of rush through the headings. Obviously, it sets out the guiding principles of the working relationship between council and officers, sets out the responsibility for delegated decisions, and, where power lies in that regard. Provides details of the specific role of statutory officers and how councillors interact with them. it highlights or sets out a kind of code of practice in relation to some complex issues, including where members are representing residents in legal proceedings, which obviously can be quite tricky. Just in view of some of the history and also in view of kind of just general good practice going forward, the protocol includes a paragraph on councillor to councillor expectations and, you know, affords those relationships the same kind of principles of integrity and respect as councillor-officer relationships. Refers to officers' reports and who's ultimately responsible for those and what they should include, because obviously they inform the way in which councillors and ultimately take decisions in relation to matters. Refers to officer advice to political groups, stressing the political neutrality of officers. Then, you know, obviously refers to local ward issues and the importance of sharing, officers sharing information in relation to significant matters in respect of councillors' wards to enable them to carry out their ward role effectively. It refers to correspondence and sets out a kind of guidance in relation to correspondence, and that obviously links to the working protocol on member briefings, which is set out further in section 5 of the Constitution. And then also refers to dealing with the press and media, and obviously Hannah can take any further questions on that, but incorporates the National Code of Recommended Practice for Local Authority Publicity and sets out the guiding principles in that regard. It refers to councillors' access to information and the common law right, the statutory right to access to various documentation, but also the common law right, which is based on the need to know, and it sets out the what the need to know is, which I'm sure you're all aware of, and then also sets out what to do when the protocol hasn't been followed, both for officers and for councillors, and where to go and how to follow that up. As I said, the devil's in the detail and is quite detailed, so I'm happy to take any questions.
Can I ask Councillor Austin first, please? Okay, Councillor Crittenden.
I just thought, as the visitor, I'm not on the working group. Rather like the other item, I only have a very brief comment on this particular one. I actually thought the document was excellent. I mean, it just really was very, very clear. I just, down at the end of the proposed protocol on Annex 1, para 3.7, one of the bullet points under para 3.13 under there, it says quite rightly that councillors should be writing to directors and heads of services or the main generic one. And then under the bullet points, it says that officers will respond in a timely manner. We know that we have had a history of that not happening and difficulties, which resulted in an attempt a couple of years ago to rectify that, which was not successful. I have spoken to Hannah just now, and I understand that those things are being dealt with again. But I don't think that this, the wording of this document recognises that our heads of service and directors are swimming in emails. And actually, as councillors, I think it's worth saying that we need to respect that as well. So however that's worded, it's just that we have to write to the top person. We're not supposed to write to anyone else. But it does mean that if we all write to the top person, they could end up with an awful lot of emails in a week, on top of everything else. And if they spend all their time answering emails, then they're not doing the job. And I just think that there should be some way of recognising that. So I'll hand that back over to you to think about in there. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's really helpful, and that's absolutely acknowledged and recognised. And I can think of a form of words that might reflect that. But obviously what I don't want to do is for the protocol to lower standards and expectations. We want to set a tone and obviously recognise if there are, you know, particular issues. We need to think about how those are brought to the relevant officer's attention, so that and obviously I think you all know that there are some proposals to look at some supports, a support staff member for councillors, and I think that might go some way to remedying that issue. Thank you, though.
Thank you.
Councillor Austin?
Thank you. I'd like to echo what Councillor Crittenden said. This is excellent. It's so much better than we had before, both in terms of the scope of what it covers and its positive tone, because the previous one, I'm afraid, did rather tend to focus on what people couldn't do rather than what they could and should be doing. So this is great. I've got quite a number of questions, and I wanted to pick up on that point in particular, because one of our suggestions during budget time to Cabinet was that the proposed role for support for councillors should actually be a couple of roles for support for heads of service, for precisely the reason that Councillor Crittenden has suggested. So obviously I'll just leave that there, but I do think there is a real difficulty with admin support, lack of, for heads of service, and as Councillor Crittenden says, if they're replying to us, they're not out there doing their jobs. May I go through this and ask specifics? So
Absolutely, yeah.
Para 1.7, this protocol applies to councillors and co-opted councillors. Should it say maybe elected and co-opted councillors? Would that make it clearer? Because I'm not sure councillors and co-opted councillors.
Absolutely happy to amend in those terms.
Then next, page 2.5, the thing about the party whip at the bottom, the last bullet point. Councillors are required to act independently on planning, etc., and should not be subject to the group or party whip. Not all of us parties have a whip. Can we have any group or party whip, please?
You can.
Thank you. In the section on officers, 2.7 and 2.10 seem to copy the same wording, and I'm wondering if they could perhaps be amalgamated.
Sorry, which paragraph?
2.7, officers are responsible for the day-to-day managerial and operational decisions. It then says the same again in 2.10.
Apologies.
And I think those two could probably be amalgamated. They do say rather different things after that, but...
Okay,
Yep.
I can look at that.
3.2, the last line, councillor should not victimise an officer for discharging his or her responsibilities. Victimise feels a bit strong to me. Is there something pressurised, criticised, something? Victimise just feels like something very extreme.
It's gone to the top end, yeah.
Yeah.
Acknowledge that.
The item that Councillor Crittenden referred to, 3.7, we're talking about going to a head of service and whatever. It says there will be appropriate answers where a junior officer is the only officer with the relevant expertise to address the issue. Can we add all up-to-date information? Because quite often going to that officer, because that's the person who's dealing with that particular estates problem or litter problem or whatever it be. And so it makes much more sense to go direct to that officer if they're comfortable with that. I asked the same question about response protocols, but I'm ever so pleased that we haven't got pages and pages and pages of response protocols, because I think one of the dangers with having that is that it becomes like KCC and speed limits. You know, the poster that they have that says it's a limit, not a target. You know, we have in the past had people who timed their responses at 10 to 5 on the day when it was going to go over the SLA and so on. It's just a nonsense. It's got to depend on the circumstances, hasn't it? I do think that in 4.6, where we're talking about legal proceedings, it says councillors must not make contact with any officers. We've already talked about directors and heads of service. I think it should say councillors must not make direct contact with any other officers engaged in the proceedings, to make it clear that it is okay to, in a matter of crisis, to contact.
Happy to clarify that. And
finally, in the local ward issues section, 8.2, can we have wherever practical rather than where practicable?
You can.
And at 8.3, ward councillors should be notified at the start of the exercise. Could we have at or wherever possible before the start of the exercise? Because we do have a tendency to find, you know, we're walking down the street and somebody, a passerby, tells us something that's going on in our council that we don't know about.
So at or wherever possible before the start of the exercise.
Yeah, brilliant. And then I wanted to ask a question in the section about correspondence and emails about confidentiality, and I'm thinking about the situation that we have at the moment where we have a member who is publishing his correspondence with you on social media. And it strikes me, can we have something that says we shouldn't be doing that? Because surely we shouldn't be doing that.
I mean, that's addressed in other parts of the Constitution.
It's elsewhere in the
It is,
Constitution.
but I mean, for measure, we can certainly include something in this section as well. But it certainly is addressed in. I can't remember exactly where, but certainly
something else
clear,
somewhere
yes.
else. Okay, that's great. Thank you. And then there's a few proofreading things. If I just give you this bit of paper, is that okay?
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
cheers. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Austin. Does anybody? Councillor Scobie?
Yeah, and just following on from Councillor Austin's point there is a little bit of the elephant in the room on this, which is this is an asymmetric relationship between officers and councillors, because officers are employees who, if they misbehave or some mistake is made, will go through a disciplinary procedure, and there are rules on this. And as we have found over the last 10 years at this council, is that the same is not the true for councillors. So I welcome this document. I completely agree with Councillor Austin and Councillor Crittenden. It's well written, but there is a flaw at the heart of standards at local authorities following the changes, I think back in 2010, 2011, where sanctions or against councillors were removed. So it is toothless. And I think, it would be remiss not to acknowledge that, and some of the issues that are going to keep coming up are because of that asymmetric relationship. There is a second part of that relationship which I do think is worth sort of raising as well. It came a little bit in the agenda tonight, and it's popped up various points, and that's the asymmetric lack of access to information, because officers work on stuff all the time. As a councillor, so for example, I work full time, have a family, I drop in and out of things. And if you can't access information when you've got it, when you've got the time, you've missed your opportunity. And so I welcome what's in here. I think it probably covers it, but I think it's worth acknowledging that lack of access to things like the intranet site and being able to click on hyperlinks and actually go somewhere, or assumptions maybe being put that councillors know why a particular agenda item's coming to a committee and the reason why there's timescales is missing, and particularly for backbench councillors, it's very, very difficult to get access to information. So it's a step forwards, I think, with this document, but I think there are some challenges that there's no document that we can produce is going to cover that it's worth acknowledging.
I understand it that the LGA are looking to reinstate powers for standards committees, having had it, as you rightly say, taken away by Mr Pickles back in 2010, 2011, and I believe that is what's in the pipeline at the moment, but when the end of that pipeline is near, I don't know.
I suppose the other thing to say in relation to that, it depends on, some councillors have, the utmost regard for the standards process. So, it's meaningful if councillors have regard to those sanctions, but if it's only those councillors that refuse to have any regard to those sanctions where it becomes meaningless. But obviously many councillors do have regard to those.
Mr Hughes?
I was just going to, in fact, no, you go, Nick, because I'm going to go on for a slight tangent afterwards.
Well, it's one of the things that we've certainly talked about, which is that personal opinion, I agree with you that the standards regime can be seen to be toothless, but I think it's really important that we continue to follow the processes, because I think in the past the council has come unstuck where the council has felt that it is powerless to take, I wouldn't say action, but to deal with and deal with complaints in a fruitful way. And so it essentially stops doing that. But that's when the government comes along and says, well, is there a problem? And you say, well, yes, we've got lots of problems. And they say, well, have you got any complaints then? And you go, no, because we stopped bothering about that process because we felt the process was toothless. So I think it's really important that we do continue to do that, even if as you say, ultimately, there isn't the sanctions that we would like to see at this point in time.
Councillor Scobie?
Yeah, and just on a related point, and it's probably moving slightly away from the agenda item, but if Chair, you're happy, it's sort of related to the discussion we're having here. You know, the currency in the council of, if you're a backbench councillor, is the opportunity on a committee or at full council to ask questions, to raise points and be part of debates, and they are time limited. And quite often, as we found with recent full council meetings, your opportunity to even get a motion debated within the 30 minutes is quite limited. Is there a way, because again, this happens in the House of Commons all the time, where if you have people acting out, you know, the Speaker literally makes a point of saying, well, you obviously don't want to be called today to speak. Is there anything in the Constitution around, you know, if people are not engaging properly in the rules of debate and you know, refusing to sit down or speaking over other people for the chair to say, I know there's the steps of saying this, you know, the member will not be heard more, and then but like there's softer things before that, which is just to, you know, do that. And is there any reference to that in the Constitution? I understand, Chair, I'm moving away a little bit from this agenda item.
I think I'll kindly pass that on to Mr. Hughes to answer.
It's not specifically referenced within the Constitution, but should have been covered at the chairman's training that we've given to councillors. But I think that chairmanship is an extremely difficult skill to manage and to become very good at. And I think some people are some people pick that up very quickly, other people take longer to do that. But yeah, I think, as I say, a lot of it is to do with personalities and the way that a chairperson can manage the meeting in a very different way to the way that some people do at the moment, I think might prove to be helpful. But that's not meant to be as an individual criticism of anybody in particular. But I think, as I say, it does come down to individuals. But yes, the power to tell people to rein people in, I think, is certainly within the power of the chairman. Just as it's one of those things that doesn't need to be written down. It's within their power to do that if they wish to do that.
Councillor Austin.
I just wanted to pick up on Councillor Scobie's point about imbalance between officers and members, to point out that that doesn't just sit on the disciplinary side. There's also a well worked out support system for the health and well-being of officers, which we don't have for councillors. And that, I think, is something that we would benefit from looking at again more closely, obviously having had recent incidents of members needing support and not knowing where to get that support from. There are going to be issues, and obviously you're going to be having a meeting to discuss this, Ingrid, which is much appreciated. But I think that there are some imbalance issues there, which we probably can't do anything very much about, but maybe a bit of thought towards support systems for members would be helpful.
Yeah, it's acknowledged there's an imbalance in that regard by virtue of the employee status. But obviously, I do know that councillors can have access to the Employee Assistance Programme, and obviously I'm completely aware of those issues, and it's something that I'm, very alive to, constantly thinking about, and will continue to do so, and happy to enter into discussions to think about how best we can support councillors in vulnerable positions.
Councillor Britcher.
Oh, thank you. It's clarification as much as anything else. Section 8.8, so on last point on local ward issues. It mentions here, that MPs may be invited where relevant. It also mentions officers may meet the MP separately if considered appropriate. In those circumstances, would the ward councillors be told the officers are meeting the MP about this privately, or would it just happen?
In most cases, I would expect ward councillors to be notified, but obviously it would depend on the circumstances of the meeting and what it was all about. But I would expect for the most part, ward councillors would be notified. But I couldn't give you a hard and fast answer to that.
No, thank you.
Are there any other comments from any members? Well, I think taking the step forward, I think the proposal probably is that we've heard from Councillor Austin, and Ingrid is going to take all on board the suggested amendments you've made. Do we vote on that as a proposal, or do we leave it for it to go back to Ingrid and then come back to the once the amendments have been made?
No.
Right, okay. In
If
that
that's what
case,
members want to do, obviously.
do councillors wish to make any more recommendations? Could I have a proposer for what we've just said? Councillor Austin, and a seconder? Councillor Pritchard. Thank you very much. And do councillors agree? Agree. Agenda item 6, I call on Mr Hughes to introduce the next item.
Thank you, Chair. So this report covers the way that the Council makes constitutional changes. So currently the Council has a 3-stage process. So we meet here, constitutional review, that's then forwarded to the Standards Committee, which is then in turn forwarded to the full Council, who are the overall arbiters of what is in and what is not in the Constitution. We are proposing to change the current 3-stage process to a 2-stage process, so that we would have a constitutional review committee, exactly as this, and then that committee would make recommendations on to full council for them to adjudicate and judge and agree and make the final changes to the Constitution. The current process is quite time-consuming. The lead-in times to reports can be quite long. When you've got a constitutional change you want to make, it has to go through 3 meetings, which is quite a lengthy process. We also looked at what other councils in Kent do. So we are quite an outlier on the number of stages that we go through. So only Swale share our 3-stage process. The vast majority of other councils have a 2-stage process, so they have some form of constitutional committee that then makes recommendations to full council. Unless you're Gravesham, in which case sometimes, most of the time, it just goes straight to their full council meetings. So I'm not sure that I would recommend taking detailed constitutional changes to a full council meeting. I think council meetings are long enough as they are. I don't think you'd be there all night if you were dealing with individual changes to the Constitution. So, yeah, this allows more time for members and more time for officers by not repeating the same stages again and again. It is the other things to mention is that the Constitutional Review Working Party is a fully constituted council committee. It's called a working party, but it's not subservient to anybody else. It is its own committee in its own right. So it's no less a committee than Standards is, or Planning, or Licensing, or any of the other committees that we have. So we're asking you to propose that we change it from a 3-stage process to a 2-stage process, but I'm happy to answer any questions that members have.
Councillor Crittenden.
Thank you. I do have a lengthier set of comments on this one. And some of what I have to say picks up on issues that have already been started and set off by Councillor Scobie. I appreciate the need for speed and efficiency as the drivers for the recommendation to reduce from a 3-step to a 2-step process. But only a couple of months ago at full council, we had a bit of a backbench revolt, which led to one item being referred back to CRWP. I'll briefly mention on that, I wasn't at all surprised by that revolt because as a member of Standards I had raised the same concerns as were being raised by other members at that full council. I had received some reassurances at Standards but was still only barely satisfied with the changes being proposed, which is a lesson learned for me because I should have listened more to my own instincts on that occasion. And that's because any attempt to reduce backbencher rights to ask questions, often their only recourse to information and visibly representing their residents, should be ardently resisted by backbenchers, as it was on that night. And I mention that because it is relevant to this item, because on that occasion Standards should have picked up that there would have been a backbench revolt to that proposal from CRWP. The fact that it didn't on that occasion doesn't mean that the step should be removed, quite the opposite. Constitutional changes are important. There should be checks and balances on the way. But this working group and Standards both have a very, very small membership. But with a different membership, that second step can and should bring in a fresh pair of eyes on the matter. I appreciate that both the Standards and the Constitutional Review Working Group do actually have the same chair, and sometimes I think that does influence us, but as members it's our responsibility still to take it independently. So I actually have some questions regarding item 6, and that is, I note that few other councils have a 3-step process, and there is even one without it. However, before making any decision on this matter, I would suggest that this working group should actually have answers to 3 questions. How many members are there on the equivalent to CRWP in other councils? Because the more who are involved in the decision making at this stage, at this first step, the greater the diversity of experience and views that can be brought to the matter that is being discussed. Secondly, how many councils with a 2-step process face more challenges when recommendations go to full council, as we saw a couple of months ago? And thirdly, this is the research analysis on that, what is the interplay between those 2 factors? Do larger working groups or constitutional review groups or committees have fewer challenges, or, to put it another way, do smaller groups face more challenges? Without the answers to those 3 questions, I don't feel that I would have, if I was on this committee, enough information needed to make this significant change in a procedure. Despite what happened a couple of months ago, Standards have and do make changes to CRWP proposals in that second step, which is surely better in a committee than in full council, because, referring back to what Councillor Scobie said just now, in full council, standing orders mean that backbenchers in particular only have one opportunity to speak in a debate, and that limits a genuine free exchange of ideas. We've had situations in this meeting tonight where Councillor Austin and Councillor Scobie have asked and exchanged a number of times, and Councillor Britcher. We can't do that. As backbenchers, we can't do that. We have to stand up once, and if someone else says something later on that makes us think of something else, we have no other opportunity to do it. And my fear is that without that genuine exchange and debate that is possible within a committee, then there could be decisions that are made that we don't feel comfortable with as backbenchers, but they still go through. And so on that ground, I really would like to see, at least in the first step, the members of this committee ask for those questions to be answered. So I hand that over to you as members to see whether or not you are happy with what I've said. And thank you for listening to me. Thank you.
Councillor Britcher.
Thank you. Yes, I thought Councillor Crittenden made some very good points, actually. I mean, my instinct is to actually look at, because obviously it says here Tunbridge Wells do it as a minor changes have just the 2-step, but the bigger changes have the 3-step. And I think that's probably worth looking at, especially with the points Councillor Crittenden made. Because, yeah, we don't want to just rush some of the bigger things through. Yeah, that's my point.
Thank you. Councillor Scobie.
Yeah, I find this quite a tricky agenda item because it makes absolute sense if we're going to do a major review of the Constitution that trying to schedule 3 sets of meetings to try and push it through, it doesn't make sense, especially as we are talking about potentially standards as part of the boundary review potentially going and being merged into governance and audit. It feels like we're creating something that's very, very difficult to sort of pull together. But on the flip side, I have to say that I find the whole work of Constitutional Review Working Party very, very confusing and almost set up in a way to make it very difficult to follow how we got here. Because this is sort of popped up out of nowhere. And you said, Mr. Hughes, that it operates like any other committee. All the other committees that I'm on set out their work for the year, set out where they're going with stuff. And we got this agenda a week ago. Some agenda items came a little bit later. The actual meeting was just sort of dropped into diaries. I had another meeting this evening, which I've had to cancel, and but that's life sometimes with these things. But it isn't running like another committee. And I raised this at the last meeting. I raised it at council. This is the second time an issue has been brought to Constitutional Review to look at, which is an officer recommendation for something that would make officers' roles easier. The last time was around amalgamating questions together. This time we've got steps in the process. There is absolutely no way for backbench members of this council to bring changes to the Constitution. I don't see where that is. There's nothing in the Constitution about how you amend it. And when I asked it last time, I think it either comes from the monitoring officer or the leader of the council. Now, the leader of the council is normally a member of this committee, which makes it slightly easier, but that to me feels very complicated. So I'm sort of going on a roundabout sort of discussion to say I would echo quite a lot of what Councillor Crittenden said, that I do have some questions around it. But I do come back to my first point, which is it does to me make sense, but if we're going to make that change, I do agree that the membership of this committee needs to be expanded so there is more representation, and I do think the meetings of them need to be much more structured and so members understand what's coming, why, and the background to this, because otherwise we get agenda items pop up like this and it's very difficult to get into that headspace.
Yeah. No, I think that raises some very fair points. We had a meeting with the leader, didn't we? And this was an item that we raised with him, and he asked us to take it forwards through the constitutional change process. But equally at that meeting, I think we do take on board your point about having a more clear work programme, and I think that's a very valid point. Until recently, it was, I would say that previously our remit was to review the Constitution, which doesn't make for a particularly brilliant work programme. But now, having spoken to the leader very much more, there's a very clear set of things that we want to look at, which we can put into a work programme. And the other thing is, again, and it's a point that Councillor Austin has made in the past, which is how do you get stuff on the agenda? I think, as I say, we are looking at developing a protocol and a form where members can suggest things which then come to this committee, and then if that's something that the committee wants to do or thinks it's a valid idea, can then be put on a future constitutional review working party. It is not a diarised regular meeting in that sense, due to the fact that it only has one role. So if there aren't any constitutional changes coming through the pipeline, there's no need for it to meet. That's the way it's set up in the Constitution. We're happy to change that if people want to make it into a diarised sort of meeting. I don't have a problem with that. But we would then also want to make sure that we'd sorted out this issue before we diarised it, because if we did diarise it, we would diarise it in advance of the standards meetings. But yeah, I think, as I say, I don't disagree with any of the points that you raised, to be honest.
Councillor Austin.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'd like to support what colleagues have said, and thanks for your willingness to be flexible on Nick. I mean, it feels to me like if this is a committee, it should be called the Constitution Committee. It should have a proper membership. It should have a proper work programme. It should have diarised dates. It doesn't necessarily have to meet every 5 minutes, but it does. People do need to know when it's going to meet. They do need to know how they can bring an issue to it, and it needs to have a better representation across the board. I think there are useful things that such a committee could do, but at the moment it feels like just the terminology working party, it kind of feels like, well, we'll do these things and then we'll be finished and then we'll all disband and go home. And actually, if it is a proper council committee, then let's look at it at that. Let's try and broaden out its membership so that we're looking at bringing in a broader range of experience and views. And let's have a clear system for how we're going to engage members in that. And in the meanwhile, perhaps pick up on Councillor Britcher's suggestion that we go with this for minor changes, textual things and whatever, but we don't try and do it for anything major, because I think Councillor Crittenden is quite right. We need backbench members to have the chance to look at these things and discuss them, and they won't get that at full council.
Councillor Scobie, have you got something you wish to add before?
Yeah, I think we've got to make sure we don't miss the wood for the trees here. You know, this is a complicated process, and we're all saying that we want it to be simpler, and the proposal on the table is to make it simpler. So I think I think we should broadly support this, bearing in mind this has then got to go to standards, it's got to go to full council, and as we know from the last council meeting, if through that process things need to change, we can amend it at full council. So I do think there's no point in us going, let's kick this back and then go, let's tap this into better shape. It comes back in a month's time, we do the exact same thing. We can actually go through a process here. I think that there's probably 3 things for me that needs to happen. So I absolutely go for a 2-step process. Makes sense to me, and I agree with Councillor Austin. You know, let's make this committee much more of a focus. The second thing is I think the membership needs to be expanded, as I said, and I think we need to try and get each of the group leaderships involved. I just don't think we can be sat here talking about changes to the way the council is going to be run and not have leadership of each of the groups, or something represented. I mean, tonight we've got nobody from the second largest group, so it sort of feels like it undermines the credibility of what we're doing in a sense, because it allows somebody later down in the process to sort of say, I wasn't involved, we didn't attend the meeting. And even as a good point against that, it's not really what you want. You want people to be involved in the process. And I think the third thing is that I don't think you need to have regular diarised meetings, but I think it is appropriate at the start of each municipal year, so after we've annual council, for this committee to come together for a meeting to set out its work programme for the year. And if there are no planned changes, then it's a very quick meeting. And it is literally, there are no planned changes this year. The only reason we would meet is because something has come up, that either legislation has changed, or we have spotted something, or council has decided it wants to make a change. But it will allow you to then set out the things that you want to do, and allow us as members to be much more involved. If we're sort of comfortable that that's the path we're going down with this, and you know, colleagues are looking at that and democratic services are, I feel like I can support this, because I do think there's opportunities at standards and full council for this to be worked through. But being honest, if I support it tonight and then it goes to standards and nothing's really changed and it goes to full council, it won't be me voting it. I think it'll be pretty much everybody saying we're not going to make an opaque process even more opaque.
So are you asking that we add something to the proposal of 3A that's on the papers?
I mean, what I'd like to suggest is that if we're going to a 2-step process, that we rename it, we recommend that the membership is expanded, so rather than it being quite a small group, it should be larger, and that we have a regular annual meeting to set out the work for the year. Those would be my 3 recommendations. I don't know whether we've got the power to do that, but then yeah, that's what I would propose.
Obviously all the proposals have been written down by Stephen. Have we got a seconder for that proposal?
Can I just double check what the proposal is?
Sorry about that. So to go to a 2-step process for the CRWP to be expanded and to organise a regular annual meeting to be set up nearing the end of the municipal year.
Change the name.
Change the name.
Change the name? Change the name as well. Constitutional Review Committee.
So are we going for Constitutional Review Committee?
Committee, certainly, yeah.
So, in relation then to proposal 3A with the amendment, could I have a seconder, please?
On that understanding, I'll second it, yes.
You're an acting member, so you've got to vote.
Am I subbing today? I thought Rick just invited me to watch.
I think he said you were subbing.
Oh, I had a point of question actually on this, but
Fire away.
I'm on the committee. Good. So just to preempt what standards would say, could standards say actually we take the view that we're not part of this process, but we can be invited to CRWP to speak under 20.1 or send our questions or queries to the chair, just to try and preempt what they might say to this.
Well, theoretically, yes. I think any member could do that if they wanted to. If any member had any issues with any of the reports that went to a constitutional review working party, they're more than welcome, as Councillor Crittenden has done, to come along and speak under 20.1 and put their point of view across.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just. I think that might be the comments coming from standards then, if that's the case. Just to give my feedback on the proposal, I think that makes perfect sense. As a contract manager, which is my old trade, the definition of expanded CRWP might need to be a bit tightened. Like, what does that mean in practice? Is it one person? Is it? So I don't know whether we as a committee might want to tighten that to say in line with other committees, or that wording might need to be a bit tightened up.
I think Nick will come in. Doesn't the political proportionality change every year anyway? So I just think it needs to be bigger than it is now. But so like governance and audit is 15, and that's probably too big, and this is 8, and it's probably too small. So there's a Goldilocks committee in there.
I would say, I'd really appreciate you not putting a number in, just because that's going to make, if you choose the wrong number with no evidence, then that will make the proportionality extremely difficult to get right. But I do absolutely take your point. Yeah, we'd be looking at a committee somewhere around 11 or 12-ish. That sort of ball.
Yeah, and I think making sure that every party,
absolutely,
and as you do with I don't know, general purpose is still the committee it was when I was on 10 years ago, but all the party leadership were on general committee because it's where all the nasty stuff went.
I would make the point that crudely bums on seats is a matter for group leaders. It's not something that officers can tell you to have. Certain people on certain committees, that's entirely in the gift of the group leaders. But as you say, if it's seen as an important committee, then you would hope, as you say with GP, that certain people would be on it. Or if those people weren't, then other senior members of a political group would be a participant in those.
But as we've just seen from the councillor officer code of conduct and document we've just approved, officers' advice, goes a long way towards this. And I think as groups are looking and, working out what the balance is, saying to people, actually, this committee is not boring, actually, this committee deals with important rules of debate, I think is a very soft way of making sure people take it seriously.
And I think we've just all had assurance from Councillor Crittenden that the next Standards Committee meeting will be interested in relation to these matters.
And putting you both on the spot, I mean, because obviously this is going to go from here and it's going to end up in full council. do you both, like, you broadly supportive of what we've just proposed? Because
Councillor Yates?
I guess my question is related to the next steps, which is if the new rules say that it's the Constitution Review Committee is the one in charge of Constitution, then surely the changes at standard should come back to here, but that slows down this whole process even more.
no, because full council makes final decisions.
Yeah, so we make our change, standards could make further changes, then it goes to full council without coming back to us. I don't know if that's an issue or not, but
It can, can't it? But sometimes we send it back to CRWP, and sometimes because I think last time Councillor Everett managed to get a little sideswipe into me because I'd made 2 amendments to 2 other things at standards, which didn't come back here. But that's down to the chair to a large extent. Sorry, thank you.
I think it's safe to say that the new committee will probably be formed after the next council annual meeting. Would I be right? Looking at the timescale?
Yeah.
So we've agreed on that proposal and we've had a seconder, and do all councillors agree?
agreed.
And I think that concludes the business for this evening, and thank you all very much, and meeting's closed at 8:04.